proclaiming Christ, victor over sin and death. You're listening to Ancient Faith Radio, your Orthodox Internet radio connection.
Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. My name is Father Nicholas Lowe. So grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday, August 22nd. Tonight I'm joined by my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
Good evening.
Roxanne's a clinical psychologist, and we've teamed up over the last several years to bring you a show that marries both faith and psychology to give you some practical steps that you can live by in your own walk of faith each and every day. Our show airs every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Ancient Faith Radio. We do want to invite you, as we do every single Tuesday, to join our social media platforms. Friends, we are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, all under the headings of The Louhs. And that last name is spelled Louhs. In fact, all of our sermons are archived on our Louhs YouTube page. So if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube page, please go ahead and do that just right now. Again, that's at The Louhs. And if you're interested in receiving our daily inspirational messages, we started this a couple years ago. Just a message of encouragement that you'll receive in your email inbox every day at 7 a.m. If you're interested, go to our website at thelouhs.com/subscribe. And friends, if you're already receiving those messages, as I know that many of you are receiving them, do us a favor. There is a link on the actual email where you can share it with your friends and family. Do us a favor, help us to share Christ's light and just inspire people. We never know what's going on in the lives of our friends and family sometimes, and it just provides an opportunity to give them some encouragement as well. As always, we'd love to hear from you, especially in tonight's conversation, and we invite you to do so. There are a number of ways that you can do so. One is by calling us during the live broadcast of our show at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question during the live broadcast of our show by emailing us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And we're also broadcasting as well on our Facebook pages as well as Ancient Faith's Facebook page. So feel free to leave a comment or a question there in the comment line, and we'll definitely get to it as soon as we can during the show. So today we're giving you part 2 of a series that we started a couple of weeks ago dealing with addiction in the family. You know, friends, millions of families today, as they hear our voices, are living in homes with people who are struggling with an addiction. Now, these are the ones that have identified themselves as having an addiction problem. But there are many more living in the world where people are living in homes that have not embraced or, in fact, accepted the fact that they have a problem. Not only is the addict the one who's struggling with this disease, and I'm specific in using the word disease, as we'll talk about in a few moments from now, but in addition to this, it's also experiencing and impacting the families psychologically, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. They too can be struggling at this very moment with depression, guilt, anger, and at times distance from God and from others. Let me just take a moment and to share with you a little statistics about how bad addiction is impacting our nation. Do you know, friends, among people aged 12 years old or older in 2021, 61 million people, or 21%, almost 22% of our population, were using illicit drugs within that year. Almost 22%. The most commonly used illicit drug is marijuana, which 52.5 million people use. Nearly 2 in 5 young adults 18 to 25 are using illicit drugs. and 1 in 3 young adults aged 18 to 25 have used it over the last year. Hear this one as well. 9.2 million people 12 years old and older have misused opioids in the past year. And to make matters worse, in 2021, just a couple of years ago, 94% of people aged 12 years old or older with a substance use disorder did not receive any treatment. Nearly all people with a substance use disorder who did not get treatment at a specialty facility did not think they needed treatment.
I was speaking with someone actually the other day who was worried about her adult child, a young man who was struggling with alcoholism. And she was really struggling with this sort of notion of helplessness, with every sort of facet of this disease. And she said, what did I do wrong? And why is God not helping my son? It just feels like a helpless battle that we're fighting. And for so many, whose lives have been affected by addiction, we have with us tonight a very good friend of ours, Dr. Ioana Popa, to speak about this topic. I want to introduce you to her because she's a pretty amazing woman. She's a trained physician psychiatrist who recently completed her Master's of Theological Studies degree at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. She has both taught and provided psychological care through the Office of Spiritual Formation and Counseling for nearly 10 years. She's also a co-founder of the Witness to Christ, which is a spiritual journey program in the Antiochian Diocese of Worcester in New England. She's also a certified life coach, internal family systems practitioner, and an advanced grief recovery specialist. She's the medical chair of OCAMPER, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. And together with her husband, Sebastian, who is an interfaith chaplain and life coach, they co-founded Team for the Soul, which is a coaching, consulting, and spiritual care program to help people in their journey of life. Dr. Ioana, what phenomenal accomplishments, all for the glory of God. Welcome to Live with the Louhs.
Thank you so much for this warm introduction. Thank you. I feel very humbled by all your words and really appreciate your show. And I feel honored to be here tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Ioana. It's a blessing to have you as with us. And so let's get right to it. I know that there's many people that are tuning in with concerns. Maybe they themselves are struggling with an addiction or around people who are struggling with an addiction themselves. Addiction is so common nowadays, but as a physician and spiritual care provider and life coach, how can families think about addiction?
This is such a great question. I think there's so many facets. As you mentioned, I'm trained as a physician psychiatrist, and currently I'm working more of a spiritual formation life coach and trainer and educator, but I'm going to put my psychiatrist hat right now because I used to work with patients with, for many years with substance use disorder. And also I worked in a veteran administration where they had a 6 months domiciliary program, which was, they would come for program there. I also work in a partial hospitalization program for substance abuse where people will come for several months, for several weeks for that. And I've also seen in my private practice also work with families dealing with this. And now in my coaching and spiritual care practice, I work with families that are especially Christian women and things like addiction and what to do with adult kids or younger children or other family members come up a lot. And I want to share that substance abuse has, like anything else, there's this mixture of nature and nurture, meaning there is a strong genetic component to it. And in the same time, there are environmental factors. And the reality is that our culture nowadays, especially in America, is a very fast-paced culture that puts a lot of focus on accomplishments right away, getting quick wins. And there's not a lot of focus on delayed gratification, so to speak. It's a very unpopular topic.
It sure is.
To think about that. There's all everywhere. There's ads. And I really feel for parents nowadays because with the advent of social media, many times kids are already, their brain is, which is very plastic at a young age, is so trained with social media that only reinforces those very circuits in the brain, quick gratification. And so there's a lot of pressure. So if you're listening and you have a family member in the situation, I just want to say that there's a lot of things against us, so to speak, nowadays, especially culturally. And I hope that you can find support and group to really navigate this, because it is complicated. There's many, many layers, and I can, go into some of those layers. But I did appreciate your statistics that you brought, and it's not getting any better. So yeah, I really appreciate that. So I can go into more details, but tell me a bit more.
Well, I think,
levels.
Right. I think that one of the things that, and just let me give a little reminder to our listeners tonight. If you have a question for Dr. Ioana, please feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com, or feel free to leave a comment on our Facebook page. That's the Louhs Facebook page, or on Ancient Faith's Facebook page. We can definitely get to it during the live broadcast of our show.
Yeah, Dr. Ioana, maybe we could talk a little bit about, I know we had a question come in sort of about the physical drivers of addiction, whether, there is this sort of hereditary component. You mentioned the nature and the nurture, maybe we could talk about sort of how these diseases sort of are, like how they give birth in somebody's life. I mean, there are so many people who can pick up a drink and never have another problem with it. And then there are those who the initial drink, sort of seems to set into motion this stream of events within the body that seem almost automatic, and irreversible without taking a hold of it. So maybe we could talk a little bit about those sort of more physical drivers of the addiction and the hereditary component that makes it so hard for certain people.
Yeah, I think it totally has to do with there's genetics involved, and it's interesting because these genetics are not just for substance abuse. I mean, many times we think of addiction of substance abuse, but I want to include here also food, social media, right? There's anything that can produces a quick reward and a quick fleeting moment of feeling good, a rush, has the propensity to lead to addiction. And it's important to know that there are many, there's several chemicals that can lead to addiction, and the substance per se can do that, right? You're talking about alcohol or marijuana. They have different components. For example, I'm just going to pick, I had conversations recently about marijuana in young adults. In some states it's legalized now. So it produces a quick response. Many times it's calming, and I'm going to use a parallel with food. Let's say someone has a bad, stressful day, and they might have food or ice cream or something sweet, comfort food. What it does is it works through what's called operant conditioning. So it decreases the uncomfortable sensation on one hand, but in the same time is going to produce a positive response, which is pleasurable. So it's a double whammy, because on one hand, it removes something uncomfortable. With alcohol could be the same, or with drugs. And in the same time, there's a positive effect. But then the next day or hours later, the underlying symptoms, they might come back, right? So we think of genetics, but it could be an underlying depression or an underlying anxiety that is driving this, or another mood disorder that is driving this. And then the symptoms might come back. They were in the first place. And then there's a need for comfort. Oh, what do we do? Well, that helped me. That particular substance helped me. So we use it again. Now, for many substances that produces substance abuse disorders, there is usually an aftermath, some sort of withdrawal symptoms that will pile up some sort of secondary reactions. So, for example, marijuana, pot, it stays actually in the fat system, adipose system, for about 30 days in the body. So someone might use it today, but for 30 days, it's going to still be stored in the fat tissues, no matter how slim someone is. We all have some fat tissue, and it's going to be released slowly. So it's going to produce some sort of negative effect, which then was like, oh, but I want to get rid of that. So you can see how the vicious cycle is almost like a hamster wheel. It's so easy to get on it. So it depends on the person, of course, depending on the circumstances, depending on the peers, the pressure that's on social media, how cool it is to use this or that. Then it becomes, initially people feel in control. Like if you ask them, they're like, oh, I got it. I can stop at any time. And then before you know it, it's really hard. And now I've shared this on my YouTube. I've used to smoke when I was in medical school, out of all the places. You would think that is unheard of. Well, in Romania, everyone was smoking back then. And I did it for 7 years. Stopping it was so hard. I have addictive genes in my family. It was very, very hard. And it was only when I went on my knees and I prayed to God, God, you have to stop me here. And there were some events that happened that really helped me to actually stop, that had to do with identity. But it's not so easy for opioids, for alcohol. It's not so easy to stop. But it does require, first and foremost, motivation for the person to really go to their knees, so to speak, like, I really want to stop this, and I can't, I need help. Until they really reach that point, anyone externally sending messages, you got to stop, they're going to feel oppressive or whatever the justification, or whatever is going to land with them, but it's not going to land well. And there's actually psychological frameworks that I can talk about, like Prochaska, stages of changes. There's some stages of changes that people don't just stop because someone else tell them. They really need to really get to the core and
themselves.
Agree. Yes, exactly. Which is sad in some families because they go to an extreme.
What advice do you have, based on specific ages, to family members who may be worried about someone in their family to prevent addiction? I mean, we have so much available. And as you said, we don't know which genes are going to sort of set into motion this process for people. What do you recommend, sort of by age, to help family members help prevent addiction before it ever begins?
That's a great question. And by the way, addiction genes, I mean, you would know someone in your family, right? They have had either a problem with eating or with a substance abuse. And it's good to be open about it in a certain sense, like, hey, we have those genes in our family. We got to be careful here. So I would say if someone has young kids, it's really important to think of how to train the kids in a very loving way, what's called in psychology delayed gratification. In other words, help them to not get everything they want in the same moment that they want. It's okay to wait a little bit. Of course, it's going to be age appropriate, right? It's one thing for a 1-year-old or 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, but this idea that it's okay to train and even explain to kids that it's a life skill to wait a bit more. And I would caution parents, I know that's probably going to be very unpopular, but this idea of social media use or having kids to use iPads or iPhones really young, it can backfire. Now you might be like, what do you mean? My kids need this for school or they're already using it. Sure. But you can develop some rules about it in a way that is not restrictive. Like, oh, here's the phone. You did something wrong. I'm going to punish you. Take the phone away. Versus think more about and explain that to your kids level of responsibility and maturity versus level of freedoms. This is one of my frameworks I use in helping parents to think about that is you might have a 14, I'm switching now, they're the older kids, but you might have a 14-year-old that behaves, the way they make decisions is kind of like a 10-year-old. Like, then you can explain, I know you really deserve more, but right now your behavior is for a younger child. So your level of freedom is going to be for 10-year-old, but you can change that. You work on empowering yourself and take responsibility, be trustworthy, say what you do what you say, things like that, and take care of your schoolwork. And then you'll have more freedom, meaning, for example, the phone. So I would say it really starts young with the social media and access to phone and iPads to have some conversations around that.
What a beautiful perspective to bring, because, right, how does that sort of set the brain up to kind of be ready for that, quick fix just in life? We get used to it earlier on, from technology, from social media, from how quickly the phone gives us literally whatever we want. I remember the days where I used to go to a library and had to go to the card catalog to find my books and my articles. And, now it's just like hop on Google. I mean, even we are spoiled by this. And the delay, I think, is the delayed gratification is causing so much intensity, and exacerbating mood disorders. I'm seeing somebody in a traffic light unable to wait. I never used to see that, where people couldn't wait for a traffic light. I never used to see this, and I do think there's something to be said for the plasticity of the brain and delayed gratification. It's literally changing our brains. And so I do think that, here we are dealing with substances in a very new framework. The brain has a new foundation with which, we are looking for those things, and we need those things because we just have been trained, not to wait. So I really love that approach for young kids and teens. And I can't even acknowledge enough, just how readily available these things are for kids who are getting them online, actually. Most of these kids are getting substances online. They are ordering them. And it's begun, they're laced with all sorts of things. And so a lot of these kids are displaying brain damage now at young ages that the physicians are looking at and going, what has happened to this child's brain? But it's because of what they're ordering online. I mean, it's not, you don't even have to meet a dealer at school anymore, right? So, so technology, definitely, it's a scary thing.
Yes, and also the social media, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'd love to hear what you're saying, Dr. Ioana.
The social media, they have artificial intelligence that is set up in a way to keep us hooked on it, to keep our attention. So it's really moving into becoming us more and more addictive to new information, to novelty. Now, what's happened I'm going to put my physician hat here, what happens on a body level when we have something new, you think of Christmas gifts, we get so excited, we get this gift and we think, oh my goodness, this is the best thing that has happened to me. And then 2-3 months later, it's obsolete. We're not, we just don't think about it anymore. The process is called habituation. So our body, God-given body, has this ability to dampen the response. So we get an excitement afterwards, but afterwards it just becomes part of life. Well, the reality is, if we're seeking that novelty, which is so reinforced now in our culture, it's going to give the buzz, so to speak, whatever that is, from gift to food to substance, if someone uses substance, and then the body's going to get used to it. So to get the same response is actually, you need to really increase the amount. That's why on social media it become more and more addictive, because now you know more and more, you want more on the substance. At the beginning you get one response, then you're going to increase it. So it's really important to know that. And actually, I encourage parents to really talk about these things really early on. Like sometimes I've seen parents waiting until kids are teenagers to talk. We don't want to wait. Of course, if your kids are teenagers right now, just start now. The best time was when they were 5. The second best time is now. But Really start as young as 3, 4, 5, and also start explaining about a cultural phenomena of conformity. It may sound really fancy, but that's the term for peer pressure. And explain that this is what's going to happen, and don't actually believe everything that's online. Don't actually believe everything that's saying. And that's why I love
that
our
it's going to
faith,
relieve
because
your stress, right? Because that's why so many kids, I think, are going, so many kids have this sort of chronic stress that they're under, and then paired with emotion dysregulation, right? They're not sure how to manage the feelings, and then they have so much stuff that's in making them feel imbalanced. So they're reaching for this, way to help me feel better, and
That's right. That's right. And there's also influencers online that it looks cool and it looks easy. I love my dad, and God rest his soul. He passed away, but I loved him so much. He was very cool. Now he was smoking. So for me, that was a pattern that I liked. There was like, oh, he's smoking. He's cool. I'm going to smoke too. I'm not blaming him in any way. Well, my point, I'm making the parallel now with young generation who's looking, oh, this is cool. This is what people do. So it could be the stress, or it could be fitting in. But either way, it's going to pass. There's always going to be another cool thing happening in this world. And so educating kids around that, and look for that, to have them use their thinking, their higher intelligence, to really start discerning early on.
It's amazing how something that seems so innocent, like social media initially when it came out, that, this would be great. You can reconnect with people that you haven't been able to connect with in years.
Yes.
and high school friends and people all over the world. And I mean, obviously there are benefits of it, but it also perpetuates a default setting, I think, that we have within our brains, that is to find this, kind of quick fix, this yearning to kind of find some level of relief. And I think you just beautifully stated this, Dr. Ioana, that we have to be very careful what the world is offering us as any type of quick fix or any type of relief, because as Christians, obviously we know that relief comes through Christ and the church and the sacraments. But I think it's very, very, dangerous how we are in the world, that if we're not aware of really what's behind the curtain, we can kind of buy into the lie that this is just something that, it's harmless. It's not really impacting us. Whereas what we're seeing is that it can perpetuate that addictive behavior that I think within all of us we can have. So I definitely love that we're talking about this.
And the reality is that we are a sandwich generation, because we've seen, a few decades ago, depending on how old you are right now, but let's say you're in your 50s or 60s, a few decades ago, this was not an issue. As you said, when it came out, it was more harmless and now we're seeing the consequences. So I don't want us parents to blame ourselves. It's just happened. It's a cultural phenomenon, and we just need to really realize that and just find creative ways to support each other. So find your group, find your community, and really start having conversations, including with your family members, but not when it's conflict. Right. Outside of conflict, let's bring those to the table. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, you're trying to say something, Dr. Roxanne.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and for those of you who are just tuning into our show, we're speaking with Dr. Ioana Popa about addiction. She's a physician, trained psychiatrist, and filled with just such a depth and beauty about her. And we're just grateful that she's on with us this evening. So Dr. Ioana, if there's already an addiction in the family, what can families do? And how important is abstinence as the action plan?
That's great. Well, I want to bring in spirituality here and faith, because ultimately, this is my belief, is that we, underneath the addictions, and, we're talking here people with big addictions, but ultimately, as human beings, we all are prone to big or small addictions. But it's my belief that underneath it, actually, there is a longing for the infinite. There is a longing for God that is in us. And unless we realize that this is just kind of the smoke, the three-dimensional world that we think is going to fulfill this longing inside. We're going to keep chasing something, now it's a substance, or now it's the house or the work or the car or whatever that is, when in fact we're just replacing one with another, versus realizing that this longing for something that is bigger than us, to the infinite, it's actually a longing to connect with God that only God can fulfill. And it's a beautiful thing when someone can really touch to that. I love the idea of primary theology versus secondary theology. We know about others, from others about God, from others, secondary theology. But ultimately, everything is pointing so we can experience it in our soul, God. So going to your question about, I think you're asking about, okay, if someone has already addiction, I think it depends on the age, I would say, and depends on if someone has disability or not. So I make a clear distinction between if someone is a minor, or obviously if it's an elder that might be impaired, or if someone has a mental psychiatric disorder that can be impaired. Let's say someone has acute bipolar disorder or psychosis or intense major depressive disorder, and their functioning is really impaired, or the substance use disorder is so impaired. This is, for families, this is kind of the litmus test. So if they're young, I'll talk about it in a second, but let's assume that we're talking about adults that are they have their own decision making. I want to name that they are responsible. They're the captains of their ship. We want it or not. We cannot convince someone to do anything one way or the other, no matter how much we want to. I've been in this field of helping people change behavior for more than almost 3 decades, and it's impossible. The person needs to want to change. So they're in charge of their own, if they want to be happy or not, what kind of feelings, how they respond, if they want to stop or not. So I want to separate, because that's a healthy boundary to think about that way. They're the captains of their ship. We can influence them, we can support them, but ultimately they need to make that decision. So that can help us to separate also emotionally, intellectually.
If you don't mind, I just want to hold on that one thought. If when we're talking about helping that person or supporting them, and specifically with an adult, what would that look like? Can you take us down into if there's a family listening tonight who has a family member who is struggling with this, and they are looking for, how do we approach this? How do we help but not hurt the situation? What would you just tell them are some very high level ways that we can support and help the person who's struggling with the addiction?
Yes, I would say start with conversations. So the best way to, and it's in our Bible as well, if someone has an issue, talk with them 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. I would say, I'm trying to think here, what would be the best? So if someone doesn't want to change, let's just start with that. The best way to think about it is to discuss about the consequences. In other words, don't tell them, oh, you need to quit. Here's a medication that can help. Here's a treatment. Talk with this therapist, even when they don't even want to stop. So it's talking about the consequences, kind of like, okay, how's this going in your life? What are some problems? Here's what I see, right? So having one-to-one conversations about that. So in the stages of change, in the psychology of change, that's the first intervention, education. Let's talk about it, because they're pre-contemplating, right? If they're already starting to say, you know what, there might be a problem and I want help, this is where one can align with them. Now, if there are actually consequences in the family and they're impacting their finances, they maybe are not respecting the house rules, and they're adults, they need to have some conversation about, well, this is really not working for us. So a sense of a bit of assertiveness, right? And a physical, on a conversations about it, those are the rules of the house. And this is not happening. What can we do? This is not working. And does that make any sense?
I mean, 100%. I think that what I hear you drawing is a boundary, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I think, what I often see, because addressing motivation for change, it takes, for addiction, it just takes so much more than good intention to stop. So the motivation to stop has to first and foremost be there, because it's such a hard thing to stop anyway. Right. So if we don't have the motivation, you're 1,000% right. That it's we're never going to get there by saying, come on. Let me help. And people don't change until the pain they're in is worse than their fear of change, than the discomfort of change, than the overwhelming and the enormity of change. And so
exactly,
I think people sort of have to reach that point where they realize how much pain their addiction is causing. And I know sometimes, partners of an addict are so afraid to say, how this is hurting me, how much this is destroying our family. They're afraid to draw lines of moving on, moving out, setting these really firm boundaries. But I don't think that, people kind of reach that point in their life to change something until something brings them, to their knees. And that's when we realize we need God. That's when we realize our addiction has actually caused, pain that we can't fix if we don't get better. And so, I think what I hear you saying is that this boundary, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about the consequences. Here's what I'm observing in our home, in your job, in our marriage, or with our children. Here's where I'm seeing this destruction. And at some point having that moment that says, I won't be able to stay if this doesn't change. And I too often see people hanging around for so long that there's so much destruction. And 10, 20 years later, there's no change, but the destruction is worse.
Yes. And there is a saying, that I heard, what we permit, we promote. Now, here's the thing. It will depend on the situation, right? If we're talking husband and wife, it's one thing. If we're talking about an adult child, it's another thing, or a family member like a brother or sister, right? So it depends on the level of connection, depends on how intertwined the finances are, and if there are kids involved. And I would also say, if there is violence in the family, confronting might not be the best idea. And this is where the person who is in a relationship where the husband or wife has substance abuse and there is violence involved, that then they really need extra help and extra support. So I don't recommend necessarily, I'm not making any medical advice here, right? You got to talk with your doctor. You have to talk with if you have a church community, your priest who's a support, a therapist, a counselor, like reach out. Make sure you have a network that will support you. But there's some negotiations that need to happen. If there's no risk of violence, one-to-one conversations when there's no, not in the middle of an argument, is the most effective. So again, depending on the degrees also, and I wanted to name that there are now with the substance use disorder, could be severe, moderate, or mild. So it really, really depends. But
it's so important to have a team around,
yes.
Really the community that we find in church, with our spiritual fathers, with good counselors, and with, you said it yourself. Communication is, key, in having those people around you, I think, is so important to sort of discern all of these, variables that you're mentioning. It's really hard to do on your own.
It is. And I would say, so you think of external boundaries, right? I've talked about negotiation and education. That's one level. Sometimes they need to be distance, physical distance, right? On a certain level, depending what the situation is. And there's also, I want to name, internal boundaries, right? Emotional boundaries, realizing that sometimes our emotions might not be our emotions, might be a projection from the other person. The same with thoughts, right? Our thoughts might not be our thoughts. It might be just hearing things from the other person and starting believing it yourself. So I encourage to have the support and community that you mentioned to really discuss about the particular situations. And I work a lot with Christian women, and the issue might come around substance abuse or distance or other type of behavior, but they're the same principles, if that makes sense. And I do want to name one resource here. It's nonviolent communication methodology. I found it very helpful. Like if you feel like, actually, I could sit down and talk with this family member, but I don't know what to say and how do I not trigger them? If you Google it, nonviolent communication, and look for 4 steps, it's a PDF. It walks you through, okay, here's what I've observed, like one of you have mentioned earlier. Then share, here's my emotion. This is how it's impacting me. Then step 3, name the need underneath. Well, I need to be respected or whatever, finances, whatever the need is. And then make a request. So it takes away from a blame. I'm blaming you, you're blaming me. I'm talking about the consequences here. So
I love that. We are speaking with Dr. Ioana Popa on the topic of how do families, when families are wrestling with addiction. We're so grateful that you're joining us tonight, and we do want to invite you, if you have a question or a comment, or like to just talk to Dr. Ioana with regards to our subject tonight, please call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. You can also leave us a comment on our Facebook page, the Louhs Facebook page, as well as on Ancient Faith's Facebook page. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you'd love to receive a daily word of encouragement, we send these out every single day. They're just little messages that merge faith and psychology together. And you can do so by going to our website at thelouhs.com/subscribe. So it's thelouhs.com/subscribe. And all you have to do is simply put in your email address, and every day you'll receive one of our daily inspirational messages at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Dr. Ioana, we've got several questions that have come in via email. I wanted to get to one that just came in about 5 minutes ago. And this is the question. It says, I've always had a problem with medically defining addictions as diseases. Today, so many conditions seem to be readily labeled diseases in the medical community. However, as Christians, we also see sin as a spiritual disease. But there is a difference between physical diseases we have no control over, like Parkinson's, and the spiritual disease of passions. But isn't addiction a sin? These are several questions. Isn't addiction a sin? Where is the intersection between physical disease we aren't responsible for and spiritual disease of sin that we need to repent for? Where does addiction lie?
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say many times it's true that people use this term, oh, it's a disease. So that means I don't need to do anything, it's a disease, medical disease, and that's about it. Just let's get used to it. But I want to name this that disease, it's actually dis-ease. We are not at ease. We are not whole. There's some disturbance, so to speak, that it's impacting. And many times, this is the hardest thing with anything that's going on psychologically. Any mental health disorders, substance abuse included, or depression or anxiety, bipolar disorder, because it involves our brain. It involves our thoughts, involves emotions and motivation and will. The line is very fine, and the listener is correct. How do we know that? Isn't this a sin? Shouldn't we be resolved and confess our sins and move on? Well, here's the thing. The sin, the best definition in the ancient Christian faith is that we're missing the mark. So yes, we are missing the mark, and we need to come back to Christ. But sometimes what happens is the body is it gets engaged into the disease, the dis-ease. And the best article that I read about it that made so much sense to me as a psychiatrist was from another psychiatrist who's also a priest, Father Thermos from Greece. And he talked about it, and he just brought this in clear, simple ways. We have to remember Christ was not just God, he also had a body. So we have, yes, our spiritual life, but it's intertwined with our physical body, which is so true. We are psychosomatic beings. Our church predecessors, fathers and mothers, were talking about that. This is not new, but now we know also from medicine. So they're influencing it. And I'm going to give an example now from diabetes or just having high insulin, right? So if someone is imagine someone eating 20 donuts a day, I'm exaggerating here, right? The sugar is going to go up, and the body's going to try to cope with this. And eventually, if we're continuing to eat 20 donuts a day, the body is going to get into a dis-ease. It's going to not going to be able to compensate. It's not going to be able to, with a God-given functions, to come back to what's called homeostasis, the baseline. It's the same with substance abuse or depression. Let's say someone has depression, something really bad happened, and they're really, really sad. Well, if it passes a certain point, now we know, let's say 2 weeks, that is going to produce changes in the brain, and then it has a life on its own. And on a biological level, it's the same with sugar. High sugar, after a while, it's called prediabetes, but then when it moves into diabetes, then even just with a diet alone might not be enough. People might need medication. It's kind of like the same with substance abuse. Initially, the will, so to speak, is not captured, but at some point, it just erodes the different psychological functions as such that it's becoming it has a life on its own, which is indeed sin, meaning we're missing the mark, but it's engaging the biology now. So the intervention has to be on both levels.
I mean, I just love that explanation because it is so true that the body can work against repentance in a pretty profound way when we're trying to change directions around something that's separating us from God. I mean, and you're right. I mean, we see this, in eating disorders. We just see this in so many ways where the body and mind and spirit are all, unfortunately or fortunately packaged as one, but none of that means that we don't have responsibility in it. And I think that, sometimes that question where people struggle, and I've heard that before, we're calling it a disease. Does that mean somebody is not responsible? I mean, I think it does not mean somebody is not responsible for helping to change the physical, side, but it's a battle that I think we fight both spiritually and physically. Right. I mean, it involves both layers.
And I want to name that actually medications can be very, very helpful. And I want to reframe that because sometimes I work with Christians that are like, no, I don't want medication, prayer alone. Well, prayer can help, but prayer is not enough because we're only addressing the spiritual aspect. We want to, based on the situation, and the doctor can tell you if the biology is involved, the body doesn't want to really fight against us. It's just been conditioned in such a way that right now is outside of homeostasis. But if we can help it, it can come back. And there are actually medication that can help with substance abuse, which they're very, very helpful, including for alcohol. There are medications for opioids. They're quite helpful.
I mean, and let's keep in mind, 50% of people battling addiction, we know, have co-occurring mental illness. So, this is something also physically we have to address in the brain. What is happening, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Ioana, what is happening underneath the addiction? It's not just a willful choice, but doesn't mean we don't have responsibility to attack it.
Dr. Ioana, we have just a few moments left in our show. We've got about 10 minutes, and I wanted to get to this question that I think so many people, listeners, I'm sure, are dealing with, and that is, can dealing with a family member with addiction lead to burnout, and what can they do about their own self-care?
That's a great question. Yes, I see that a lot. One of my areas of interest is burnout as I'm working with Christians and especially Christian women. And, it's exhausting, right? It's exhausting to have to deal with particular situations. So I'd say what's most important is to do make space daily to take care of oneself and find ways to separate emotionally and on a thought level around those issues. Because the more we think about it, the more we're not going to necessarily solve the situation. Like, set aside time to think, set aside time to ask for advice, but worrying about it and constantly ruminating about it is going to drain and just sap our energies, and we're going to burn out. And I think I might have talked last time in your show that, and I'm using my framework is daily renewal blueprint to regenerate 4 times a day: morning, midday, afternoon, and night, and really find ways to separate emotionally and on a thought level, so that we can really regenerate and take care of ourselves, even if you have 10 minutes. Just do something for your body, do something for your emotions, to relax, for your spirit. And there's a reason why at Vespers we pray, right? Let us put all the cares to the side. We want to do that because otherwise the brain is just going to run in the background and constantly, or subconscious, constantly running, so to speak, recycling thoughts. But that's very draining. So I would say finding ways to separate emotionally and at a thought level, and definitely taking care of your own body and regenerate.
And Dr. Ioana, speaking of your blueprint, and then you have so many wonderful resources for people. And if our listeners are interested in the programs that you offer, where could they find those resources?
So that's a great question. Thank you so much. I would say I'm on YouTube, Team for the Soul, Dr. Ioana Popa. I have a channel for Christian professional women, especially dealing with burnout, moving from burnout to joy, from grief to hope, and just find a way to reach the highest potential in Christ, to give. I have a heart for serving, and I want to support Christians that are really wanting to serve. And on our website, Team for the Soul, you will see that we have several programs. I have a curriculum for Christians, men and women. It's called Growing in Christ, where there's a course every month that really walks through the renewal blueprint. But then there's things about how to befriend our thoughts, emotions, how to think about our environment and sanctify it, how to the Jesus prayer, how do we think about that, and how do we use our brain capacities or train our focus, things like that. And I do have also a community for Christian women. And also I do one-to-one as well, where I put all my expertise for decades to how to do meaningful transformation.
I love that. I think what you offer, Dr. Ioana, not only in your ability to articulate so beautifully things that sometimes are so difficult to express, but also how much you desire to help and make a difference in our world, and especially just amongst people that are struggling. And I think one of the things I love about that you're so much a part of is the OCamper, the OCamper conference, and you serve as the medical chairperson of OCamper. Which, if you're not part of the Orthodox Church, just so you know that the OCamper is called the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. And maybe just tell our listeners, Dr. Ioana, about what it means to be the medical board chairperson of OCamper, and especially about the upcoming conference in Chicago, where the theme is Sacred Hospitality and the Healing Encounter.
Thank you so much for this question, because I just love OCamper. So this organization is very unique. It's a national organization that bridges science through medicine, psychology, and also religion and theology and chaplaincy. So there's this intersection of many helping professionals that are all dedicated to God. And I love the board. We just announced that recently I've served for 2 years. I will not be able to continue, but I'm hoping if you're listening and you're in a medical profession, you can apply. Please do apply. It's a wonderful board. And we do have a conference in October, and I've been involved with a camper since 2014, and I just love the authenticity and the kind of, very authentic conversations that we can have around these intersections of sometimes difficult topics. And
right, and even the fields themselves. I mean, sometimes we hear about the differences in how people approach faith, psychology, and how those merge and marry themselves. Sometimes it can be a little bit, for people that may struggle with one or the other, may not see how they can be joined together and be beneficial for us.
Yes. Well, what I want to say is that science is looking how things are working versus theology, and faith is looking like why things are working in a certain way. So they're not really responding to the same question, and they're really supportive of each other. Like science will bring us to a certain point, but it will never point to what's the ultimate reality, which is our faith. So our camper this time is, we're very grateful. We have Hellenic Foundation who awarded us last year a grant for this year. So we're very pleased with that. And we're going to be at this beautiful retreat center. And we usually have a keynote from a church leader. This year is His Eminence Metropolitan Nicolae of Romania. And then we have 3 notes speakers, one in psychology, one in religion, and one in medicine. And afterwards, there's lots of workshops, papers, presentation. There's just a lot of amazing connections as well. I know, Dr. Roxanne, you were there, our psychology speaker last year, and we're just so blessed.
Was surrounded by so much wisdom. I was overwhelmed in being at that conference. I mean, really just the intersection of body, mind, and spirit. It's our constant, it's how we live, right? And so, how do we not come together and discuss what that looks like, how that works, all for to set us up to be on our walk with Christ. I mean, so I cannot say enough about this conference. And will there be, do you know if there'll be any opportunity for people to join virtually who are unable to go to the conference?
Not necessarily during the conference, but afterwards. We are planning to record, so there will be recordings for that. And I would say that what I love about this conference is which is so matching what my dogmatics professor said in the first class, in our theology class. He said, Orthodox theology, meaning the ancient Christian faith, going all the way back to Christ, is all about preserving the truth that's been transmitted for us for generation, that is relevant in the present. We engage with the present, with our culture now, without, and this is where he paused, and then he said, and all of us were like jaw-dropping, without compromising the freedom of thought. And to me, this is what our camper is. We are preserving our freedom of thought. We'll have really authentic conversations, and it is a beautiful place in Chicago. So if you are in any of these professions and you'd like to become a member, come to the conference, even just for a day, please do so. We also started in the last year, we have a community of practices, so we meet virtually online. And it's been very popular because before we just had the conferences once a year, but now there's continuity in between. So as a community, we've grown a lot. I know I've been blessed to be in the membership committee with Joel Klapak and, Dr. Randa Anderson. She's awesome. So everyone is just amazing.
I think, and forgive me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dr. Ioana. I just love this organization, and you can find out more about it by going to ocamper.org. Again, ocamper.org. It's the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, psychology and religion. Definitely take a look at it, especially, and I agree with you. We were talking about this prior to the show. I think one of the beauties of what I love about Orthodox Christianity is the true desire to continuously grow and learn and to never settle, and to constantly be growing in our own personal faith, but also growing and because the world itself is growing, it's changing, and being able to approach. And so our faith is just something that obviously carries on this wealth of tradition that's this 2,000 years of the Holy Spirit working into the lives of our church fathers and mothers, and then also God giving us that same power through the Holy Spirit to do work that can help, deal with the things that we're facing now, deal with the issues of addiction that we're seeing now at record levels, and even with our own spiritual addictions, our spiritual struggles. So Dr. Ioana, as always, we love having you on the show, and I hope that you'll come back on our show, because we definitely would love to have you to be back and talk more about your ministry with Christian women. But I do want to thank you so much, and I know our listeners benefited so much on this topic about addiction and the family.
Thank you so much for having me. Oh, yes, anytime. I'll be back.
Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Ioana.
Thank you.
We also want to thank Matushka Trudy, who produces our show every single Tuesday evening, does an amazing job, and just want to thank her for all that she does and all the great people at Ancient Faith. So friends, listen, if you've enjoyed this show, we want you to do us a favor. If you're listening to this as a podcast, I want you to share it with your friends and family. There's oftentimes you're probably watching this on either a social media platform or maybe on YouTube. Just take a moment and share it with your friends and family. One of the things about addiction and people that struggle with addiction is oftentimes it's in private. People don't like to tell people that there's family members that may be going through a struggle. And so many people, not only are they dealing with the person within their family, their loved one that they care about so much, struggling with the addiction, but they're also struggling with loneliness. They're isolating themselves. So just share this message. You never know who it could be shared to, and then maybe from that person it gets shared to other people that can hopefully help to make a difference. So Dr. Ioana gave such a wealth of information and knowledge that I'm sure could be beneficial to all of us, and especially those who are struggling with an addiction. So with that, my friends, I do invite you to join us next Tuesday for a brand new show of Live with the Louhs. We're going to be speaking with Deacon Merrick Simon. As many of you know, millions of our young adult college students are going back to school. And how do they respond into the academic environment? How do they deal with this new change and this new chapter in their life? And what are some resources that we can provide them? Deacon Merrick is the director of the Orthodox Campus Fellowship. It is an organization for college students. He's going to be talking to us all about it. You do not want to miss this, especially if you have a young adult college student. He'll be with us next Tuesday at 8 p.m. right here on Ancient Faith. My friends, God bless you all, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.